So now could we please welcome Jeannine Woods to the stage, please. Nice big round of applause.
Thanks, Brian. I'll just set the old stopwatch here so I don't go over time. Lovely to be here, and thanks to Brian for organising and reorganising the conference. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about pagan protection rituals in popular Christian celebrations of Brigid or Bríd. Brigid's Day is still popularly celebrated in contemporary Ireland. Brigid would be, along with Patrick, one of Ireland's most important saints. Hiding in plain sight really refers to the fact that although the popular practices I'm going to talk about here form a central part of the religious feast, we can see that there are syncretic elements here that suggest that these are geared at least as much towards Brigid, the pre-Christian goddess, as Brigid, the Christian saint. So just to make clear, there are two Brigids. There's the pre-Christian goddess Brigid, who's found throughout Europe and beyond, really, and in Scandinavia in various forms. And there's also Saint Brigid, who's the abbess of Kildare in the 5th century. So there's a lot of overlap between them, not just in oral tradition, but also in the medieval manuscript tradition, to the point where it's kind of difficult to know where one ends and the other begins. And it might be that early syncretism that explains the tenacity of some of these practices and I suppose their kind of acceptance within the Christian celebration. This is just some of the areas of commonality. They're both associated with fire, with cattle, and milk and butter, and with fertility. There's an emphasis on female sexuality in relation to the pre-Christian goddess, which we don't see in the Christian tradition, not overtly anyway. So I'm going to look at a few of the objects that are associated with this, with the celebrations. Brigid's cloak, Brigid's crosses, Brigid's belt or girdle, the Biddy effigy, and holy wells, if I can get to those, if I have the time. Brigid's Day is on the 1st of February, which is also the Feast of Imbolc in the Celtic calendar. It's one of the 4 seasonal festivals, along with Baltana, Lunas and Samhain. So these seasonal festivals are liminal times, and in pre-Christian cosmology, there are times when the veil between this world and the other world is thin, and figures from the other world can come into this world. So it's a magical time, but it also can be a precarious time. So the traditional celebrations for Brigid's Day began on Brigid's Eve, and that again is a pre-Christian practice, because the celebration of feasts began at sunset the day before. We see that with Halloween. So on Brigid's Eve, some of the objects will be brought together, or the materials used to make the objects, I suppose the objects obtain their power from Brigid, who's believed to walk the earth during Brigid's Eve and bless them. And that again, this comes from this pre-Christian idea about the thin veil between the worlds. It's not a Christian. Christian saints don't return and walk the earth, so it's pre-Christian. I suppose just to start and talk about maybe Brigid's cloak or Brigid's mantle, Bríd. This would be a piece of material or fabric or articles of clothing that would be left outside near her on the threshold overnight to be blessed. There's a very strong, I suppose, threshold kind of element to all of this. Not only is it a threshold time, the feast itself, but the objects to be blessed are often left on the threshold, and the associations with fertility and birth. I mean, birth is obviously a threshold time in the life cycle. So the Brigid's cloak would be left out and would seem to have various curative or protective properties. Depending on the region, it's associated with cures for headache, for toothache. It's a cure for infertility as well, and it's used by midwives to help labour and childbirth. It's also used, it's seen as a cure for ringworm in cattle, and it's used to aid in calving. Sometimes the strips of the cloak would be cut off and sewn into clothing, or articles of clothing were left out, particularly for people who had dangerous work. It was believed that Brigid's cloak was a protection for fishermen against drowning. So on Brigid's Eve, this was traditionally the time when rushes, most usually, or reeds or straw were gathered and left on the threshold for a period of time, and then they were brought in later to make some of the ritual objects that would be used, most particularly as Brigid's crosses. So these are variations of Brigid's cross. You can see there are a number of them there: the interwoven cross, the diamond or lozenge cross, which you see at the top, and there's a variation there in the centre. The Brigid's bow there in the bottom, number 6, and the triskel and the forearm swastika. So the three-armed and four-armed are clearly, related to the sun, the movement of the sun, as with the triskel and swastika symbols. The diamond or lozenge cross, the archaeologist Maria Gimbutas did work on this, and she found that it was widespread throughout Europe and Asia, and associated with the goddess, with a preeminent goddess. And just this is the figure, the Lady or Venus of Pazarjic, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, found in central Bulgaria from 4,500 BC, and you can see the lozenge or the diamond motif on the figure there. Just to say, the thinking is, if we're looking at the central one there, the variant of the diamond or lozenge cross, that the outer lozenges or diamonds represent seeds, and that the central lozenge, which would often be larger, actually represents a ploughed field and or female genitalia, or the womb, because this association with fertility. So the crosses then were placed in the rafters of houses and outhouses, and they were they're believed to be protection against fire, famine, and fever, also against lightning and disease and ill health, really generally, and bad luck. This is just from the collector Michael Fortune. I don't know if you can see there, an outhouse that hadn't been used for some time. So this here, covered in cobwebs, is a Brigid's cross. And here then is a blessed candle from Candlemas, because Candlemas falls on the day after Brigid's Day. So you can see the two there kind of in the outhouse to protect the cattle, presumably. Sometimes the crosses were replaced each year, or sometimes the old one was left and the other one was just put in on top of it. So traditionally as well, on Brigid's Eve, there was a procession around the houses within the neighbourhood, involving an effigy known as a biddy, or a Bríd in Irish. And the effigy was, it could be made of some of the rushes or the reeds that had been left out, or it was sometimes a turnip was used, or clothing, and they were stuffed into a covering, and sometimes that was placed on a stick or a churn dash, and this was carried from house to house by a group of young people, and depending on the region, you could have a mix of boys and girls, and they were called biddies. Or in some areas it was just boys, and they were known as biddy boys. So the group would have dressed up in disguise normally. You can see here, this is from the 70s in Kilgubnut, and these are biddy boys. It was just boys in this area. They have these quite elaborate straw headdresses. One of them was wearing a mask there. Again, like with the seasonal festival of Halloween, because the veils were believed to be thin between the worlds, there was a risk that humans could be taken to the other world, so disguise was important. And boys, sometimes dressed as girls, I think the idea was that girls were less attractive to the to be taken, so the boys would disguise themselves as girls, so they wouldn't be taken. There's a more modern version of a biddy here, as you can see. It's a doll with with a four-armed cross on it, and this is another biddy boy, and this one on his very kind of elaborate headdress has the diamond or lozenge cross there, as does the biddy over in the corner on her clothing there, if you can see that. So they would, the biddy troupe, if you like, would go from house to house, and they would perform entertainments and be given food or money. And there was a ritual in some areas in accounts. We have a kind of a ritual response to the giving of the food or money. And they would say, if you ever be short, Brigid will give you some, at which point they'd be given a drink of milk. And they would respond to that, may none of your cows die during the year. So it's interesting, I mean, as I don't have to tell people here, that apotropaic objects protect against sorcery that is often seen as motivated by envy. And so this kind of ritual of exchange and reciprocity, and there's an emphasis on generosity, with which Brigid is associated, or both Brigids are associated, is interesting. Maybe as a means of kind of circumventing that kind of envy. There's a redistribution, there's a reciprocal exchange. The whole the giving of food and gifts was seen to protect the house, from losing its luck during the year, and it was also believed that it would guarantee ample butter production during the year. So it's interesting in maybe thinking about it circumventing that kind of envy. Brigid's girdle, then, this is an illustration from the museum. Again, it was woven from the rushes or reeds into a long rope, which was then closed, and it had crosses woven into it. These ones look a bit like crucifixes, but it wouldn't have been a crucifix. It would have been one of the forms of the Brigid's cross. And there was a ritual associated with Brigid's belt. Sometimes this took place alongside the biddy procession. It was brought along, or sometimes it took place in the family home with the family. But the rite involved passing through it 3 times. There was coming out of it right foot foremost. There was there was a specific kind of ritual way of doing this, and often women would have passed through it first, and sometimes children were passed through it. So it was a rite of protection, again, and blessing. It's thought it may have originally been a birthing rite, kind of symbolising the journey of birth, if you like. We do have some accounts as well of very large Brigid's belts being placed on the doors of outhouses of cow houses, and the cattle, as they passed through into the cow house, would have obtained the protection of the belt or girdle. So just to talk a little bit about holy wells and patterns, they're widespread throughout Ireland, obviously, and as well as some in Scotland. They're usually associated with particular saints, and often associated with specific cures. Patterns are these kind of the ritual rounds that take place of the holy well or the site on the feast day of the saint, or on another allocated day, if you like. And there are prayers said in a particular sequence. There's a particular kind of ritual way of doing this. Traditionally, they were pretty major social events. People would travel from far and wide. They were almost festival-like, and in some cases denounced by the church as pagan activities, if you like, and attempts were made to, I suppose, stamp them out. Generally, not successfully, really. So there are a number of wells associated with Brigid, and again, they're associated with various cures. Again, infertility comes up, eye ailments, toothache, and also general healing and general blessing. Curing or seeking a cure at holy wells and at holy sites sometimes involves the tying of a rag to a sacred tree, a bilia, or to leaving it at the site in order to obtain healing. It might be a piece of clothing associated with the afflicted area of the body. And I just, now this is, oh gosh, that's very small, you won't be able to read that. Okay. Well, I'll just read a bit of it, I'm not going to read all of it, but it's a letter from the Reverend O'Connor to his brother. His brother was a landlord in the early 19th century in Ireland, and the Reverend O'Connor visited the estate clearly, and he says, he tells his brother that I've often inquired of your tenants what they themselves thought of their pilgrimages to the wells of Killarroch, Bríd, which is Brigid's well, Muir near Elphin, and he goes on, where multitudes annually assembled to celebrate what they in broken English termed patrons' days. And when I pressed a very old man, Owen Hester, to state what possible advantage they expected to derive from the singular custom of frequenting in particular such wells as were contiguous to an old blasted oak or an upright hewn stone, and what the meaning was of the yet more singular custom of sticking rags on the branches of such trees and spitting on them, his answer, and the answer of the oldest men, was that their ancestors always did it, that it was a preservation against gasadriacht, that's gasadrumadriacht, i.e. the sorceries of the Druids, that their cattle were preserved by it from infectious disorders, that the Dina Maha, i.e. the fairies, were kept in good humour by it, and so thoroughly persuaded were they of the sanctity of these pagan practices that they would travel bareheaded and barefooted from 10 to 20 miles for the purpose of crawling around on their knees around these wells. So there's certainly in that account an awareness by people of the the pre-Christian elements of what they're doing, and that would be true really in some areas into the 20th century, that people would be holding, they would be practicing pious Catholics, but also holding these other practices which were seen as very important because they've been passed down and were often carried on in spite of strong denunciation by the church. But I just wanted to kind of mention that before having a look at one of the wells associated with Brigid, Brigid's well in Liscannor in County Clare, and this would be a site that would have a pattern on Brigid's Day. And I suppose that parish priest, whose name escapes me now, I can't remember, but it was quite supportive and encouraging of some of these popular practices within the kind of church celebration, if you like. So this is, you can see this is Brigid's girdle here, the Brigid's girdle rite being done at the site of the well, which wouldn't have traditionally been the site where this would have taken place, but it's I guess it's a kind of a revival of the practice, if you like. And just bearing in mind the idea of leaving rags or pieces of fabric, this is something that has always been a feature of Brigid's well in Liscannor, but I think as the well, possibly because I suppose there's greater awareness of it now, this is just one section of the well which is kind of enclosed, partially enclosed, and this is just a small portion of the items and the articles that are left at the well. You can see a lot of rags, fabrics, handkerchiefs, ties, but there's every kind of thing, mass cards, photographs, sweets are left, candles, every kind of thing possible, and it's really it's absolutely chock-a-block full of items that are left for blessing at this well. So while some of these practices, just to conclude, I suppose, have declined, I haven't heard any accounts of the biddy procession, certainly since the 80s. I think Brigid's girdle is probably not widely practiced. We see it there in the scanner, but that's more a revival. But some of the practices certainly have endured. Brigid's crosses are still made and hung in houses. as much, I suppose, out of cultural interest, maybe, even for people who are not religious, there is a whole kind of neo-pagan interest as well. So that's that feeds in there. But it has, some of these practices have certainly endured all along. And I hope this highlights the persistence of elements of pre-Christian cosmology and worldview within traditional and popular religious practices in Ireland. Brigid's rites are not the only context where this happens, but they're one of the most marked, maybe, in their clear connections with a preeminent female goddess, which endured despite, or maybe even because of, the partial refiguring of Brigid as a Christian saint. Thanks.